Before I get into anything, I want to start off by saying that this isn't another video about frames. I promised that I was done with that and that I would move on to something else. This is just a video that was inspired by my previous frame build, so I will use them as an example to explain why... Oh, damn it. I just made another frame video. But wait, hear me out. Don't start rolling the introduction. So the reason I decided to make this video was because I got a few comments on my previous ones about how I was reinforcing my corners. These comments said that there is no need for any additional reinforcement because the end grain can just be glued without a problem and that the whole not gluing end grain thing was a myth. I first want to say that I don't mind these comments, and this isn't some sort of response where I'm snapping back or trying to call anyone out. I actually respect these conversations and people telling me their thoughts and their approaches, even when I don't agree with them. Like in this case. I actually think these conversations are very important, and I always want to encourage others to be open, even if they think that the person they're talking to won't agree with what they're saying. Because having these conversations where people can disagree and share their opinions openly is imperative to the progress in any field, woodworking included. So please, never feel shy to share your thoughts with me or in general. I also want to say that because I've been very open about being a hobbyist and how this channel is more about me learning as I go and sharing that process rather than me presenting myself as an expert that is teaching you how to do things, this makes it tricky to make definitive statements like this where I say, you should never do this or you should always do that. I feel like I have no place to tell someone who might have more years in woodworking than I do that they are wrong with how they make their joints. But, on the other hand, I do still think that it's fair to provide a logic behind my reasoning for why I choose to follow these rules, especially since they aren't just something that I came up with, but are rather strongly accepted, tried and true approaches that many woodworkers have stood behind for generations. So this video isn't to diss anyone who disagrees with my stance on this, but to rather provide my reasoning for why I feel so strongly about this and why, on my channel, I will continue to discourage anyone from gluing unreinforced end grain. I originally wanted to talk about this months ago when I first saw a video that a creator, Patrick Sullivan, posted, and he posted this a little over 2 years ago, so I'm a little late to the party, I know. But his video is called Glue Myth End Grain. And this was a super well-researched video with properly executed tests and collected data. And in the end, all this information was used to show that glue is in fact stronger than wood. This was very cool to see done in such a controlled scientific way, and I think there's a lot of good information to be learned from this video. But when I scrolled through the comments, I got the impression that some people have misunderstood what the point of this video was, and that their takeaway from it was that you don't actually have to reinforce end grain when you're gluing it, and the whole thing is just a big old myth. And that's definitely not what the point of the video was. In response to this, another creator, Stumpy Nubs, posted a very good video that was a clarification for anyone that may have misunderstood. And I also think that this one is definitely worth a watch as well. Both of these creators are way bigger, way more experienced, and way more talented than I am. So while they don't need me shouting them out, I will still have both of their videos linked down below, and I highly, highly recommend you check them out if you haven't already. So, if everything has already been said by woodworkers who are way more experienced than myself, then why am I even making this video? Am I just going to regurgitate what has already been said for easy views? Good question, voice inside my head. I am making this because when I hear people explain why gluing end grain doesn't work, there is one reason that rarely gets mentioned, and I personally think that it's one of the most important ones. I'm pretty sure of myself on this one. Give me a few minutes to explain myself, and I bet I'll be able to convince anyone to start reinforcing their end grain joints from now on. Or your money back. I have 2 reasons that I want to cover. My first point is the most common one that I hear get brought up when talking about gluing end grain. It has to do with the nature of wood fibers. The way wood is structured has a purpose. As it sits in the ground, it has to be able to suck up moisture from the soil and get it all the way up to its leaves. It does this using capillaries. So the wood fibers are structured in a way to allow the tree to pull up this moisture from the ground along the long grain and get it up to the leaves. What this means for woodworkers is, if you apply glue to the end grain, this same capillary action used to pull up water will start pulling in the glue, which will then pull it away from the gluing surface. And this isn't great because you don't want your glue to be pulled away from the surface that you're putting it on. A common quote-unquote solution that people tend to provide for this is to put a layer of glue on the end grain first and then let it dry completely, and then this first layer will then create a seal over the end grain and will prevent the capillaries from pulling in the next layer of glue away from the surface, which will supposedly solve your problem. So now you'll be able to proceed like you normally would and just apply the glue to that surface and you will get a nice strong joint like you wanted. Except, not really. I even had to leave this note for my shopmates as I let this dry so that they don't think that I've lost my mind and send me angry text messages. This solution makes sense in theory, but it doesn't really work as well as you'd want it to. It just provides a slightly stronger, still crappy bond. If anything, I actually think it creates a bigger issue because it's very misleading. This kind of joint might feel pretty sturdy initially, but will end up failing way sooner than you think. And this is where I get into reason number 2. My main reason why I will never glue end grain without reinforcement. This reason is, wood moves. It both bends and expands. To show you visually why this is a problem in our scenario, I'm going to dig through my wood stash and pull out something that has been here for a few years and had to survive a couple of iterations of dry and humid weather. If you have ever lived in a place with wooden doors, you've probably already experienced what I'm about to show you, where when it's humid, the door will stick and feel like it fits really snug in the frame. And then when the air is dry, it'll feel like the door is too small for the frame and you can close it with almost no resistance. Even though the door is sealed by layers and layers of paint, it is still not protected enough to avoid these changes. So, take a look at this example. When we first got it, this piece used to be perfectly flat, but now you can see that it's not quite as perfect anymore. This corner lifts up a bit, and if I were to put it back and leave it for a few more years, this problem would get even worse. If I put pressure on both ends like this, you can see what the wood used to look like before it started bending. When wood bends along the long grain like this, it's called bowing. And in general, it happens more the longer the piece is. But now, look at this. When the wood bends along the end grain like this, it's called cupping. And wood wants to cup way more aggressively than it wants to bow. You can tell this just by looking, because this is a significantly shorter length than it was for the side that bowed, and yet the curve is way more drastic. But not only that. While previously I could apply a little pressure and straighten the wood with my hands, I can't do that for the end grain. I'm leaning all of my weight into it, and it's not budging. To add even more problems to this, the wood also wants to expand way more along the end grain than it does along the long grain. So this surface isn't only bending, but it's also expanding and contracting with changing weather conditions. Think about what that means for a glued surface. When you first start out, the wood is nice and flat and a certain size. You glue it, and it feels relatively sturdy. But then, a little time passes, and the wood bends a bit. And then a bit more, and a bit more. And as time keeps passing, for every single millisecond that this joint is intact, the glue is not only holding together the two pieces of wood, but it is also resisting this building pressure as the board is trying to cup and expand, and the glue is trying to keep it in place. This means that as time goes on, this joint will get exponentially weaker compared to its reinforced counterpart. No matter how strong the glue is, a joint with less pressure on it will always last longer than a joint with more pressure on it. The purpose of a reinforcement is to help reduce that pressure. But talk is cheap, right? You want to see this in action or you're not buying what I'm selling. And I can respect that. There are a bunch of liars on this here internet. Let me show you a real-life example of this. This is a picture that I grew up looking at. It was in my grandparents' house back in my home country, and it has a lot of sentimental value to me. They bought it in the 1920s while on vacation, and assuming that this frame was made the year that they purchased it, that would mean that this is at least 100 years old. When you look at it, it's obvious that time hasn't been kind to this thing. The paint is wearing off, the plaster addition is breaking off, and the corners? Look at the corners. All 4 of them are completely separated. The cracks were already starting to form when I was little, but since then, they have slowly gotten worse. The wood has moved so much since it was originally made that the glue hasn't been able to keep any of the miters intact. The only reason this thing didn't fall off the wall was because if you look inside very carefully, you can see the splines. The long grain of the spline is glued to the long grain of each side of the frame. And that's what continues to hold this frame together. I asked my mom to send me pictures of corners of another one of the frames that she has, and this one is from the 1950s, so it's not as old. But it used to be covered in plaster, and still, with all that protection on top of it, the wood moved so much that the plaster cast broke off the corners and separated completely. The only reason this is still standing is, again, because of the splines. Now, I realize that looking at all of this, it might seem like a pointless additional effort because who wants to keep cracked frames anyways? Sure, these items are sentimental to me, but that's such a specific case. You're not making things with the intention of them becoming sentimental, right? But that's kind of the thing. No one makes things with the intention of them becoming sentimental. Things only become sentimental if they're around long enough for someone to associate an emotion with them, which means that a requirement for sentimentality is longevity. If I can take 10 extra minutes out of my build and add another 100 years of life to the thing that I am making, just like the makers of these frames did, then in my opinion, that is definitely time well spent. Also, keep in mind that these frames are just a visual example. There's an even more important point here, and I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of that. We are talking about joinery. Frames are one thing, but imagine if you're making furniture, or anything that is load-bearing. Imagine sitting on a chair or a table where the glue was slowly cracking, like with my frames, and you had no idea. The subject now goes from a simple inconvenience to an actual hazard. Like for these chairs that I made a while ago, when I talked about why this supporting bar needs to be glued along the long grain. When we talk about things that last, one part of it is making things that you will keep around for a long time because they're built with quality in mind. But an even bigger part of this is making quality because there's a pretty big safety factor here. And also, once you get into the swing of things and get comfortable with proper joinery techniques, it is honestly not that much more effort to just make things right. Yep, that's it. That's my argument. That's all I got for you. If you were team gluing and grain before, did I change your mind? Or were you already on my side before you even clicked on the video? I'm legitimately curious, so let me know. Also, this time I'm extra serious, no more frame videos. Even though I somehow managed to use a different method for each one that I made so far, enough is enough. Next time you see me, I'll be working on something different. I promise. So until next time, bye.